Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to our distinguished participants from America. Good evening to our dear colleagues in the Middle East. A warm thank you to our speakers, Ilan Goldenberg, Hans-Jakob Schindler, and Kelsey Davenport, to presenting today. It is with great pleasure to welcome you all to our discussion on the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is a joint event together with Atomic Reporters. A very timely discussion, as we can follow the ongoing diplomatic proximity talks here in Vienna, actually very close to our office premises, between Iran and the United States through the European Union acting as an intermediary. I do not want to go into further details. I'm looking forward to hearing and learning more about the nexus of these complex negotiations. I would like to give the floor to Tariq Raouf, who will be moderating today's event. Tariq is board member of Atomic Reporters and former head of verification and security policy coordination at the International Atomic Energy Agency. Dear Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I too would like to wish everyone a good day here in Western Europe, in North America, and in the Middle East, and wherever else you might be logged in from. Thank you for attending this online discussion, as Claudia mentioned, on this very timely topic of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the way forward. This session will be recorded and made available on the website of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is in Vienna. The opinions and views that are expressed in this event are those of the speakers themselves and do not necessarily represent those of the organizers. This online discussion will be moderated, and we request the participants to put up their questions or comments in the chat box. Now let me introduce our three speakers in the order in which they will be speaking. So we have Ilan Goldenberg, Senior Fellow and Director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for New American Security in Washington. He is a foreign and defense policy expert with extensive government experience covering Iran's nuclear program, including as a senior professional staff member on the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee, covering Middle East issues, and as a special advisor on the Middle East and as the Iran team chief in the Office of the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Ilan has been requested to broadly discuss the Biden administration's position on the restoration of the JCPOA, the various debates and divisions within the administration on rescinding sanctions on Iran, and on the sequencing of the steps both for the US and Iran to return to the JCPOA, and any other comments he might wish to have on the Vienna proximity talks. Then we will have Hans-Jakob Schindler, the Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project in New York and Berlin, and he also serves as the co-chair of the advisory board of the Global Diplomatic Forum in London. He has served as team coordinator of the ISIL or Daesh, Al-Qaeda and Taliban sanctions monitoring team of the United Nations Security Council, and as first secretary for political affairs and liaison to the security forces at the German embassy in Tehran, as well as special advisor to the ambassador. Hans, we have requested to speak on the views of the three European countries and the European Union on this matter of the restoration of the JCPOA and the sequencing, and how these talks are proceeding from his point of view. Then we will have Kelsey Davenport. She is the Director for Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association in Washington, focusing on the nuclear and missile programs of Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan, and reporting on these areas for Arms Control Today, which is the flagship publication of the Arms Control Association. She is the lead author of the P4+1 and Iran Nuclear Deal Alert newsletter, which assesses developments related to the JCPOA. We are requesting Kelsey to also broadly discuss perspectives on the JCPOA, especially from the Iranian position on the ongoing Vienna proximity talks, as well as her views on the internal political dynamics in Iran regarding the restoration of the JCPOA, as well as any views she might have on the Biden administration's views on this issue. As we understand, there are different views in there. Claudia already introduced me, but I also wanted to mention that since the Iran file started in 2002, the IAEA has produced more than 100 reports. And I was fortunate enough during my time to be part of the team that wrote more than 50 of those reports. And I also have served at the IAEA as the person responsible for experience of nuclear weapon-free zones relevant for the Middle East. So to set the scene for this discussion, I wanted to say a few words and also to show a few slides, which I will now proceed to put on screen. So Iran has a nearly complete nuclear fuel cycle, from mines to conversion to enrichment to fuel fabrication to reactor operations. It also has a facility called the molybdenum iodine xenon facility in Tehran, which is equipped to carry out reprocessing of plutonium, but Iran has never done so. And in every report, the IAEA continues to verify that the mixed facility has not been engaging in any reprocessing of spent fuel for the extraction of plutonium. There are somewhere around 19 facilities in Iran that are under IAEA safeguards. The ones that are most relevant from a proliferation or a non-proliferation perspective are the two enrichment plants at Natanz, and also the enrichment plant at Fordow, as well as the research reactor. And there was one research reactor under construction that was subject to JCPOA limitations, as well as the heavy water plant. And then you have the Bushehr nuclear power plant, as well as some other facilities under IAEA safeguards. As we know, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed here in Vienna in July of 2015, which has various limitations on Iran's nuclear program. In addition, the IAEA and Iran signed a roadmap for the clarification of 12 areas of possible military dimensions to Iran's past nuclear activities, and this was completed on the 2nd of December, thereby enabling the implementation of the JCPOA. Iran's nuclear program is a very old program. Actually, Iran was a beneficiary of the United States Atoms for Peace program, and it received its research reactor from the US, at that time fueled by 93% highly enriched uranium. The reactor was then converted to run on under 20% uranium, and that is the fuel on which the TRR, or Tehran Research Reactor, used for production of medical isotopes, is operating. Iran is an original party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has a safeguards agreement in force. I led the IAEA team in August of 2006, 2003, where Iran agreed to implement the protocol. So it implemented the additional protocol voluntarily from December 2003 to March 2006, and then again from October 2015 until the 23rd of February this year. If we look at the IAEA's inspection effort under the JCPOA since July, more than 8,000 inspection days, over 120 short notice or no notice inspections, especially at the 3 enrichment plants, supplemented by daily visits under the JCPOA. The total verification cost to the agency paid for by the member states is nearly 90 million euros thus far. Iran has taken a number of steps after the Trump administration decided to exit the JCPOA in May of 2018. Iran waited for a year and then did a number of steps which it announced in advance to the IAEA. The latest 2 significant steps were on the 15th of February, where Iran announced that pursuant to a parliamentary decree, it would stop the voluntary implementation of its additional protocol, as well as the various transparency and monitoring measures pursuant to the protocol. However, the safeguards measures will continue. And then on the 13th of April, Iran announced that it would start enriching uranium to 60% at the pilot fuel enrichment plant at Natanz, which is the smaller of the 2 enrichment plants. If we look at the production of low enriched uranium and stockpiling above the 300 kilogram limit of the JCPOA after the United States exited the deal, and then Iran also decided to move out of the JCPOA limits. This is a slide prepared by Bloomberg News, Jonathan Tyrone, who writes on this issue, and you can find a number of his writings on the Bloomberg webpage. So let me come back with a few final comments. As you know, proximity or indirect talks have been taking place here in Vienna over the past few weeks. They have set up 2 working groups, one on the rescission of US sanctions and the other on the nuclear matters, whereby Iran would reverse the steps that it has taken to move out of the JCPOA. I believe in his presentation, Hans Jakob will talk about the stockpile and the activities that Iran has undertaken, so I will not go into it there. But I wanted to mention that in April this year, there was an explosion at the main enrichment plant at Natanz, the fuel enrichment plant. But we understand that in late April, 2 weeks after this explosion, there were still 5,060 IR1 centrifuges installed in 30 cascades in the same configuration as they were at the time of the JCPOA, which is on the 14th of July, 2015. And then Iran apparently will bring this number up to 6,000 centrifuges, and it will add nearly 1,000 centrifuges of the IR2M design, perhaps another 1,000 centrifuges of the IR4 design, as well as some other centrifuges for a total of somewhere in excess of 8,000 centrifuges once its program has been implemented, and this Iran has informed to the IAEA. Finally, just to remind, the IAEA has 3 verification objectives at a safeguards plant. One is to verify the production of enriched uranium as declared by the operator. Second, to ensure that there has been no clandestine enrichment and no clandestine removal of feed material or enriched uranium product from the plant. So these measures will continue at the 3 enrichment plants in Iran, despite Iran not implementing the additional protocol, because these will be under Iran's safeguards agreement. With that introduction, let me now invite our first speaker, Ilan Goldenberg. We are looking forward to hearing your comments, Ilan.
Thank you, Tarek. Thank you for having me. Thank you for to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for having me. And thanks for everybody who has joined us for this discussion. And great to be here with Kelsey and Jakob as well. So I'm going to speak a little bit about sort of the Biden administration perspective, at least as I see it. I don't speak for them, but as an American working in Washington, D.C., on how I think they see it right now in terms of the Iran nuclear issue. I should say President Biden campaigned on returning to the JCPOA, and then after returning to the nuclear agreement, negotiating what he's termed a longer and stronger agreement. Longer and stronger meaning, I think, meaning expanding some of the limitations, especially some of the sunset provisions in the agreement. And then stronger meaning also starting to address other issues outside the agreement, whether that be missiles or regional dynamics and things like that. And so I'll talk a little bit about all of that. I think the administration has articulated a policy that starts first and foremost with step 1, let's return to compliance with the nuclear agreement. And as Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has described it, sort of put the nuclear program in a box, get this initial urgent question off the table, and then from there, try to build on it with additional diplomacy and agreements. Now, how successful have they been thus far? I think the administration first came in, and there were a few bumpy weeks at the very beginning, partially just normal Washington transition. You didn't have a lot of people in place necessarily. You had just a normal natural policy process even though we promised this on the campaign, are we going to reevaluate? You had a lot of sort of key cabinet officials going in front of Congress for their confirmation hearings. And Congress is, as you all know, not the parts of Congress, especially the Republican Party, not huge fans of the nuclear agreement, and even some moderate Democrats who have expressed concern. So I think that also led to some of the initial language coming out of Washington probably being a little tougher than Iran and other members of the P5+1 might have expected. But pretty much by mid-February, when the U.S., working with Europe and the EU, offered to begin direct negotiations, the U.S., I think, has has taken on a position of a desire to go back to compliance or compliance with the nuclear agreement and a willingness to engage. And I think, frankly, if it was up to the US, these negotiations would have started earlier, and they would have started directly with Iran as they have in the past. But I think there were challenges on the Iranian side that I know Kelsey will get more into that came partially out of this initial tough tone from the US, which I think was not what the Iranians were necessarily expecting, partially and largely, actually, I think having a lot more to do with internal Iranian politics and the challenges that they have with an upcoming presidential election. So you had this very narrow window of, a new American administration coming in, just starting to get settled, and an Iranian team that has a very short time frame before they potentially go into their own domestic political situation. So this has been, I think, very challenging. But after a month, and this dynamic continues to be a challenge, I think, but after a month, we were able to successfully launch these proximity talks that have been ongoing since in Vienna, since March and I think late March, early April. And the way these talks have been structured, you kind of have these, now a third working group has been added. You have a group working on sanctions relief and the steps the US would have to take to come back into compliance with the agreement on the sanctions side. And similarly, a group working on nuclear issues, and the steps Iran would have to take to come back into compliance on the nuclear side. And then a third technical group that's been established to look at how you might sequence these steps. The challenge has been, one of the biggest challenges has been the nature of this is the US isn't in the room for any of these discussions. These discussions happen between Iran and the other parties to the current JCPOA. And then basically proximity talks, people come and report back to the US, yes, no, negotiate. Frankly, it's a laborious, slow going process. And it's also very complicated, I think, technically speaking. Now, on the sanctions front, my sense is there's been a fair bit of progress. The US really does mean it when it says it wants to come back into the JCPOA, and the negotiating team didn't come with, I think, the hardest line possible. They came with real proposals for how to deal with these issues. But the sanctions piece is very complicated because the previous American administration went out of its way to try to make it as complicated as possible for a new US administration to come in. So generally speaking, you can divide the sanctions relief into three categories. One is, clear violations of the JCPOA that the Trump administration imposed that need to be removed, right? Those sanctions, just a reimposition of things that were taken off in 2015 and 16, reimposed in 2018, those need to come off again. The second category is new sanctions that really on terrorism, having to do with terrorism and human rights that are not related to the JCPOA in any way, that were not previously there, and they don't really inhibit the execution of the JCPOA. And the American position on those is going to be that those stay, right? And we're allowed under the JCPOA. And then there's this third category that's by far the most complicated, which is things that might not have been, directly related to the JCPOA or aren't a very clean, just reimposition of sanctions that were removed, but that if they stay in place, it's impossible to get any of the benefits of the JCPOA, right? And that's a more subjective and complicated measure. And part of what the American team has been doing, and there's been a lot of work on this with the US Treasury Department and the State Department in particular, is diving very deep on every one of these designations and sanctions, and there's hundreds of them, and trying to determine where they go and how you would do this and what does this sanctions relief package look like. And I've said all along, and this goes back to 2015, the nuclear piece of the JCPOA is actually quite straightforward. We've done, I believe, and others know much more about this than I do, but on this call, but we've done much more complex arms control agreements than the JCPOA. But the sanctions regime is the most complex sanctions regime ever put in place. And so unwinding pieces of that while not unwinding other pieces of that, I think has been a lot harder technically. But the good news is I think there is serious progress being made there. The challenge with the talks thus far is I believe that there's a lot less progress being made on the nuclear questions, even though they're more straightforward. It's not clear, at least from an American perspective, it's not clear how much flexibility Iran has and whether the domestic politics in the upcoming presidential election, whether there is a deal to be done between now and June. and or whether or not this is all going to have to wait until you have a new team in place in Iran, and does it slip into the summer or even into the fall when you have it after the presidential election. So thus far, my sense in the negotiations is not a lot of flexibility there, partially because this is ultimately a political decision that has to be made in Tehran on whether or not you go back in or not, and it's not clear it has been made. And so my sense is that this next coming round, and I believe they are heading back to Vienna tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, might be a pretty critical one, because we're coming up on May 20th when this agreement with the IAEA expires. We're getting to the moment very close in terms of Iranian elections. And so if we don't see significantly more serious progress over the next couple of weeks, we're probably not going to have a breakthrough before the Iranian elections. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep pushing. Doesn't mean that even if we get to the Iranian elections or thereafter, there isn't an opportunity to go back. Doesn't mean that compliance for compliance isn't the best option. I believe it is. I'm just not sure where we are and whether we're going to get there. And so I think that is kind of where we are. And I don't know if my panelists have other panelists have the same assessments or not, or we can talk more about it. To talk for a minute about longer and stronger, sort of what the Biden administration would want to do afterwards. I think there's a lot of pressure politically in Washington to not just go back to the deal. And critics will say, don't even go back to the deal. Like, use all the leverage that you have from the agreement, that's been imposed by the Trump sanctions to do a bigger deal now. Like, I don't think that's actually practical, because, you do need leverage in a negotiation, but you also need a willing party on the other side. And Iran has shown zero indication that if the US comes to them and says, let's renegotiate a whole new agreement while we keep all the sanctions on, they're not going to do anything. Like, there will be no talks. It will go nowhere. And my own view is the US retains plenty of leverage for a future negotiation, even if it goes back into the JCPOA. First of all, because this world where Iran just runs out the clock and then all the sunsets come off and then none of the sanctions are imposed, and Iran can do whatever it wants and have much more flexibility, not whatever it wants, but significantly more flexibility with its nuclear program, is not one that I believe would survive in Washington. I think the sanctions would be reimposed. And the US has demonstrated it can do that unilaterally, and everybody knows it, and the Iranians know it. And so you're going to have a follow-on agreement to sustain this. But also because the US has plenty of other incentives, whether other sanctions relief, other access to the international financial system, direct access to some American markets. There's a lot of other things the US can offer, civil nuclear cooperation in a follow-on agreement. So the US has plenty of leverage in the aftermath. And the way I see it happening is you get back into the JCPOA first. Then you shift to a focus on regional issues for a while. You let the JCPOA actually implementation work for a while. And those regional discussions will not be in the format of a P5+1. It will have to involve the regional player. It will have to involve countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel over time. And also, as part of that, so you go and you do that, it won't involve a deal over everything that we have a problem in the Middle East. Like that deal doesn't exist, but you can see small agreements, small measures to de-escalate over time progress. And then after a while, you come back and do a new nuclear agreement. You look at how you extend the JCPOA. You look at questions like the sunset provisions after you've had successful implementation for a couple of years. And so I think that is what a longer and stronger agreement will look like. But right now, I think the focus needs to continue to be on what's happening in Vienna and whether or not we can get that first step of compliance or compliance deal done, because I think that it's far from clear that we necessarily can. But I think it's critical that we try. So anyway, I'll stop there and look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say.
Thank you, Ilan. That was an excellent presentation. And what you meant by the sunsets for the audience is those are the time limits on the different activities on enrichment and so on that are contained in the JCPOA. So let me now invite Hans-Jakob Schindler for his comments.
Thank you so much. I'll just get my presentation set up. There you go. I hope you can see the presentation. There you go. So, well, thank you so much. It really has been an honor to be invited to this discussion. I've, as already outlined, been asked to look at it from the perspective of the A3. Of course, as I'm no longer in official government position or at the UN, I'm not speaking for the E3. I'm not speaking for the German government. I'm not even speaking for the counter-extremism project. I'm here to give my personal analysis of the situation and how I see the challenges. And of course, I'm not here to pass judgment on the process or the agreement itself. I see currently 4 real challenges that the E3 is facing. One is relating to the role in the current process, the proximity talks. One is how we think about rolling back JCPOA compliance violations by Iran. Third one is what has proven in the past, and I think it's playing out right now, again, the very peculiar way that the Iranians are negotiating in and out of the room. And then a couple of long-term challenges that I think will be no surprise to anyone on the call. So let me first focus on the current role in the E3 process. As already been enshrined in the word proximity talks, this is a real bilateral issue where only a bilateral solution can be found in the E3. It has at best a facilitating role, as it does right now, going back and forth between the 2 rooms where then the actual players are sitting. However, this comes at the back of a much smaller influence of the EU or the E3 in particular towards Iran compared to 2015 or the time beforehand, because the near total economic withdrawal from the EU, from the country, means there is very diminished economic leverage. And in the last 2 years, what I would call slightly overselling of what the blocking statute of the EU, i.e. the legal mechanism that supposed to shield European companies from bilateral US sanctions, or INSTEX, the transfer mechanism for humanitarian goods, could achieve. Obviously, the blocking statute has been used exactly 0 times. In addition, INSTEX has processed exactly 1 transaction so far, a test transaction. So that clearly showed the real power balance between the US and Europe on the economic side, especially since Europe is not running a state-run economy. So you can't ask or you can order companies to invest if you want them to invest. Therefore, there's only a facilitating role for the E3. And the main challenge here is going to be to purely facilitate without being drawn in by the Iranians, who are obviously trying to use the E3 to drive a wedge on the American position. Not to be instrumentalized here. On the Russian and Chinese side, at least as far as I can see, there is very little appetite at this point to put any pressure on Iran for various reasons. On the Russian side, of course, there is a much stronger cooperation, in particular as far as Syria, but also other areas in the region are concerned than it used to be before. And the Chinese have really seen the opportunity of the withdrawal of European companies and trying to push very hard as part of their overall regional strategy in the Iranian economy. You may have heard the 25 years economic cooperation. I call it MOU, the Iranians call it agreement, and the Chinese say it's secret. So we don't really know all the details of the contents, but as far as I have heard from some of my contacts, it does involve all the infrastructure projects in which primarily also in the past European companies were involved. Then the second challenge, of course, is how do we get into JCPOA compliance from the Iranian side? And there is a particular issue I'd like to point out. This is in black, all the physical limitations that are contained within the JCPOA. The red ones are based on the, at the moment, public IAEA reports. Obviously, they have not been updated after the explosion because there hasn't been a public report on precise numbers from the IAEA as far as I can see. Here, what I would like to put your attention or direct your attention to is the the 2 data sets in red, and that relates to the R&D activities. So if you look at what the Iranian side very purposefully has done since it had started to announce that it's no longer going to adhere to some of the limitations, is to put a lot of investment, far more investment, in my opinion, on the R&D side than going full out on the physical side. So not necessarily putting up the maximum number of centrifuges or enriching the maximum amount of uranium, but to invest a lot in centrifuge development, because that's the part that is really tricky to reverse. And that's where the situation now significantly differs from 2015. And that's why within the JCPOA, there have been very strict limits on research and development. And as a pressure point, I think primarily towards the EU, is the IAEA cooperation, which is a really difficult part to tinker with. We are now at the moment coming to the end of a technical agreement. I have a couple more SNAP inspections than Rauf, so I take Rauf's number. 120 plus SNAP inspections have been done since the JCPOA, which means there would be a considerable loss of transparency if this SNAP inspections would no longer be possible. So clearly, all the hardware is reversible and there is good operational practice from 2015, after the first time the JCPOA was agreed on how to reverse, how to dismantle centrifuges, how to either dilute or export enriched uranium or heavy water. But what is hard to reverse, it's not impossible, but I would doubt that it's completely reversible, is the R&D part of things, simply because things cannot be unlearned. Yes, you can ask for hard drive to be destroyed, thumbnails to be handed over, any research papers that were written to be handed over and get out of the country, but you cannot get the engineers and the scientists who now have 2 years of experience on steroids, I would say, with the handling and the development of these things. This cannot be unlearned. So Iran is going to start from a considerably higher point of experience than it did in 2015. Of course, then there needs to be some kind of solution to the IAEA inspection regime as the negotiations are going to continue, because I hesitate to think that they would be over in the next couple of weeks. So then what I would call the peculiar Iranian negotiation tactics, and this is not dissimilar to what happened in prior to 2015, but it needs something to be taken into consideration, is that the negotiations with the Iranian side always happen in and outside the room. There's of course the part that is a formal negotiation, but then there's also a negotiation by proxy, and we now have the highest number of dual nationals and actual European nationals in Iranian jails. This is not something that can be taken lightly, and the US administration correctly has pointed out that it's also making the plight of arrested American dual nationals a point of the negotiation. But also there is going to be a cycle of escalation and de-escalation, in particular now that we are coming closer. The elections for the next Iranian president are going to be in June this year. Rouhani can no longer run. Therefore, both the hardliners and last week also the centrists and reformists have put up their roster of candidates, and that this heats up in the domestic debate. I would expect, on the one hand, a further wave of escalation regionally as the hardliners, and you can see how that plays out in the tapes that were leaked of Foreign Minister Zarif, who is himself now officially a presidential candidate if the Guardian Council allows him to run. And obviously, unfortunately, the risk for dual nationals from the European side, who are always the primary targets in this kind of behavior, is going to be increasing. Now, the challenge here is going to be how to deal with this without playing into the Iranian playbook. So you have to find an appropriate response that has a deterrent element to it while you're negotiating, at the same time as you do not want to escalate yourself in order to complicate the negotiations that are going on. Then lastly, the long-term challenges that I see, and this is no surprise, obviously both the European side for many years, but also the US administrations, the previous one, this one, have highlighted both the regional positioning of Iran and its behavior there, as well as the missile program, which I think is very closely connected to the regional issue as really contentious issues. I understand that they cannot be part of the current process that is going on in Vienna, but they still need to be dealt with, because the idea was to deal with these issues after an agreement with Iran is reached already in 2015. And to put it mildly, the situation has not exactly been developing into the positive direction. You can see that now Iran is threatening Israel's border. If you look at the missile attack a couple of weeks ago from Syria, obviously Iran's position in Iraq is strengthened. There is no real evidence of a pushback of the Iranian influence over the Houthis in Yemen. The withdrawal in Afghanistan may actually, which I assume will also lead Kabul to look for additional allies in its what is in my opinion, an unavoidable confrontation with the Taliban down the line, may strengthen again Iranian position. So we need to find a mechanism this time around, because it was obviously not possible to find it last time around, on how to counterbalance this Iranian behavior. And then, of course, on the missile program, Iran has taken full advantage of I wouldn't say a sloppy formulation, it was done by purpose, but there is a loophole built into the Security Council Resolution 2233, Annex B, paragraph 3, where it talks about missiles that are capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Now, there are many opinions what that means, but there is no legally binding, commonly accepted definition of what that means. And therefore, essentially, you can argue for any missile to fall or not fall under this decision. And so a greater clarity on what is actually meant with this and why Iran would need a payload delivery over 3,000 kilometers would be an obvious question to ask, should definitely be found. So these are the four basic challenges that I see for the EU, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Ilan. That too was a very rich presentation. You made a number of very important points. And now let's hear from Kelsey Davenport.
Great, thank you, Tarek, and thanks to you and Atomic Reporters for hosting this and having me to join today. It's a great opportunity, and I've had the chance to work with Atomic Reporters in the past, and I have a great deal of respect for the organization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the factors that have driven the changes in Iran's violations of the JCPOA over the past several years, and how that might complicate some of the negotiations, going forward. So first, I think it's just important to recall, off the top, and remember that Iran's initial decision to violate the JCPOA was in response to Trump's unilateral withdrawal and reimposition of sanctions, and a concerted effort by the Trump administration to deny Iran any benefit of continuing to comply with the JCPOA. So while these initial violations were concerning, to an extent they're understandable, because the JCPOA was a transactional bargain, and Iran essentially wasn't getting its half of the deal, which was the sanctions relief envisioned, by the accord. And if we look at the initial steps that Iran took, beginning in May of 2019 to violate the deal, I think it's clear that these were about, responding to the Trump administration's pressure campaign and signaling Iran's dissatisfaction. So the slight sort of uppage of the enrichment level, from 3.67% to 4.5%, exceeding the heavy water restrictions. None of these early violations, pose sort of new capabilities or knowledge for Iran, and all of them were quickly reversible. Additionally, these didn't really change the proliferation risk, when we look at that initial period of the violations. So I think, again, these were carefully calibrated to signal Iran's dissatisfaction with the status quo, the lack of sanctions relief, while also indicating that Iran was committed to staying in the accord and wasn't going to take steps to really change, wasn't going to take steps that would imperil the future of the agreement. But more recently, we've seen a concerted shift in how Iran is violating the deal. And a lot of that dates back, to this past fall, when we saw Iran, begin to further ratchet up its use of advanced centrifuges, as Hans Jakob noted, and plan and lay out a number of violations for 2021 that are more serious, both because they constitute sort of new knowledge for Iran, in terms of nuclear capabilities, but also because they can be more difficult to reverse. And some of these have already been touched upon, but I'll just briefly, I'll briefly mention them again. So first, again, some of this is ratcheting up the use of advanced centrifuges, and has been noted, we've seen Iran deploy and use advanced centrifuges to enrich uranium far in excess of what's allowed under the deal. They've also introduced new advanced centrifuges that aren't actually covered by the original JCPOA, and they didn't get the requisite permission to do so, as would be required as part of the JCPOA process for introducing those machines. So again, that knowledge gained about the workings of those machines is not reversible. Iran is also, on track to inaugurate a uranium metal production facility. Now, Iran has experimented with uranium metal in the past as part of its pre-2003 nuclear weapons program. But again, bringing this facility online would result sort of in knowledge and capabilities that would be more difficult to reverse, and sort of would add to Iran's sort of overall capabilities, if they ever chose to pursue nuclear weapons down the road. Another step that Iran took that was significantly more serious in this timeframe was its decision to suspend application of the additional protocol and some of the JCPOA specific monitoring provisions. While the special arrangement reached between the IAEA and Iran in February that's set to expire in May mitigates some of the damage from that, I think it's still clear that any gaps of knowledge that might exist could undermine the JCPOA if it's restored, because there'll be questions about whether or not Iran conducted activities or diverted activity or materials or technologies during that period. So again, that could be an area that's more difficult to reverse and causes problems down the road. And then more recently, we've also seen Iran ratchet up its uranium enrichment levels to 60%. Now, 60% is still below what's considered weapons grade, but this is a new threshold for Iran. Prior to the JCPOAs being negotiated, Iran hadn't enriched above sort of 20%. So if we look at this these baskets of violations, which are, have already been sort of taken or planned to be taken throughout this year, these are sort of more serious. And I think there are three reasons that sort of underscore this change in the nature of Iran's violations. First, and I think this is something that Hans Jakob touched upon in his presentation, is that a lot of these appear to be designed to increase Iran's leverage heading into the negotiations with the Biden administration about restoring the deal. So some of that has to do with accumulating that knowledge in the R&D space. And I think demonstrating to Biden that Iran is serious about ratcheting up its nuclear pressure, that it has its own leverage that it can employ, if the deal is not restored. Now, I think, though, if we look at the risk posed by these violations, none of them are game changers in terms of actually being able to restore the nonproliferation value of the JCPOA. Now, if we look at, the advanced centrifuges, for instance, Iran has taken a very sort of scattershot approach to actually looking at advanced centrifuge R&D. I mean, by my count, they've invested in upwards of a dozen sort of new models, but they don't appear to have actually decided, what is going to be the main successor for their very inefficient, IR1 centrifuge. I would be much more concerned if we saw Iran sort of pouring all of its energy and its resources into developing and deploying, one centrifuge. So that's, again, I think speaks to the idea that these actions are about leverage and building up that leverage, and are not sort of indicative of Iran trying to create, the capabilities, for a crash program down the road. So I think that supports that leverage argument. The second reason that I think we can credit to Iran's decision to ratchet up these activities is that Iran is responding to a number of kinetic actions that were taken to try to sort of inhibit and set back their nuclear program. And I think by responding in a way by ratcheting up their program, sends the signal that that trying to address Iran's nuclear program through force, is ultimately going to backfire. And if we look at it, sort of the series of events, you can see how these line up. First, the legislation that Iran passed in December 2020 that laid out the requirements for uranium metal, for suspending the additional protocol, for installing more advanced centrifuges, this was accelerated by the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. I mean, Iran had actually this legislation was actually introduced in the Iranian parliament in July, but really hadn't gone anywhere, until that assassination. So again, some of this activity, is responsive. Similarly, the decision to enrich to 60%, this was taken right after the Natanz facility, was sabotaged, and Iran likely sustained significant damage to that main enrichment facility, as Tariq noted. So again, this is a responsive act, indicating that that the attempts to use force to roll back Iran's program will likely only, accelerate Iran's nuclear activities. And I also think there's a responsiveness that can be credited to, the Biden administration's decision, not to take any early or immediate action, on the nuclear file after inauguration. I think, Iran saw Biden take a number of steps in other areas, but not on Iran, despite having consistently said that he wanted to return to compliance to the JCPOA if Iran did likewise. And I think that sent the message to Tehran, or reinforced concerns in Tehran, that Biden may not be able to deliver on the deal and that he may not actually have been serious about that. And that empowered some of the anti-JCPOA factions. So again, an element of responsiveness there. And this last sort of idea that this was a responsiveness to fit the Biden administration's decision not to take early action, I think also demonstrates, the third reason that I would credit with this ratcheting up of violations, and that's the factional politics within Iran that could, I think, imperil the process for restoring the JCPOA. And there are a number of factions, but I would sort of at this point divide them into kind of three sort of rough camps. I mean, first, we see kind of the Rouhani administration and his supporters, and Rouhani really has gone to sort of Herculean efforts to try to preserve space to restore the JCPOA, while balancing that out with his need to mitigate some of the domestic politics. I mean, if you look at the decision to suspend the additional protocol, for instance, that would have been, that could have been a game changer for the JCPOA, but he created the space to negotiate the special arrangement with the IAEA on monitoring to try to mitigate that concern and keep the space open. So I think his commitment to preserving the JCPOA, I think is quite clear. Unfortunately, he faces a camp of JCPOA critics that have long existed in Iran, but I think have been empowered in the past few years because of the maximum pressure campaign and the deal's failure to deliver on sanctions. Now, I think for this group, they look at the presidential election in June and see this as an opportunity to increase their power, if the US sanctions campaign remains in place and the JCPOA is not restored. I mean, this group, I think, made out very well, in the last Majlis election amidst that maximum pressure campaign. So there, I think, that's why I think we're seeing some of these leaks, some of these actions that are perceived to damage the legitimacy and the credibility of the Rouhani administration and Zarif in particular. Ultimately, though, the decision is going to, to restore the deal or not is going to come down to the supreme leader. And I think he appears to want a deal to restore the JCPOA, but he wants it, on his terms, and, is less concerned about exactly how that timing kind of works out. So I think it's this combination of factors as to why we're seeing some mixed signals in the press, why Iran, I think, sometimes appears more optimistic about progress than some of the other parties, because Rouhani needs to present that aura of making progress, but why sometimes back in Iran we're seeing signals that the negotiators may be undermined sort of domestically. So how is this going to actually translate to progress, on the deal? Ilan, I think, did a great job laying out the different questions on sanctions, and Jacob mentioned some of the complications with dealing with the nuclear side. I would agree that the advanced centrifuges likely pose, one of the most significant risks. I do think that risk is manageable, though. I mean, as was stated, there's no kind of putting the genie back in the bottle when it comes to that knowledge. But Iran is allowed to store a certain amount of SWU capacity because of the centrifuges that it had dismantled as part of the JCPOA. There may be some way to to swap out different numbers of centrifuges to allow Iran to store some of the advanced machines that it's produced in equivalent capacities to those that were there prior. It may be possible to partially dismantle sort of some of these machines. And also, I think it's important to recognize that if our goal is a longer and stronger deal, there's knowledge that can be used in the negotiations about how these machines function and operate that can be helpful in thinking about breakout times and threat perception sort of down the road. So while these are challenging issues, I think ultimately they will be resolved. I think the JCPOA will be restored because both sides, want a deal, and their positions for wanting a deal are quite clear. I just want to say a few quick words too about the idea of longer and stronger, because there are, I think, two elements that I think are important to keep in mind, when thinking about what that looks like. First, I think it's important to recall that after the deal was finalized, Iran expressed a willingness to think about building on the JCPOA if Iran wasn't singled out. So essentially a willingness to accept further restrictions if those restrictions were also were regionalized, for instance. And I think that could be a really interesting space to look at, because as was noted, 2021 is not 2015. And one of the significant changes is the regional nuclear landscape. I mean, those of you in Vienna, I mean, are probably seeing even more clearly than we are here in the United States, some of the debate over, the Saudi safeguards and, the problems with Saudi Arabia, not updating its small quantities protocol, not accepting an additional protocol, and concerns about a possible hedging capability developing in Saudi Arabia. So looking at the regional level could address questions with Iran, but also possible emerging regional nuclear threats at all. A second point that I think is important to consider, particularly from the US side, is divorcing ballistic missiles from Iran's nuclear program. I think it's quite clear as we've looked at Iran's ballistic missile development over the years that these missiles have a conventional focus and they have a regional focus. Iran isn't seeing its ballistic missile program as an option for nuclear weapons delivery going forward. So lumping it in with Iran's nuclear program and those negotiations, I think is not only complicated, but I think it's also less likely to be successful because it won't be addressing the drivers that actually have spurred Iran's development of ballistic missiles. So I think looking at that in a regional context, a regional basket, divorcing it from the nuclear makes more sense. So hopefully, as talks reconvene in Vienna, we'll see some more progress. I'm optimistic, even though it certainly is a difficult path and a complex negotiation. So thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. That too was also a very rich and granular talk with a lot of very important points. So we have a few questions, and let me go in reverse order and starting first with Kelsey. You mentioned the issue of Iran restricting some of the verification and monitoring measures under the JCPOA, which is correct. But some of the cameras and other devices that the IAEA installed was under the Safeguards Agreement. And this predates not only the JCPOA, but also the Joint Plan of Action from Geneva. So thus far, Iran is still implementing the Safeguards Agreement. And as long as that continues, I think the agency will be able to maintain continuity of knowledge, although I think some of the parties to the JCPOA may raise questions. But I was looking at your website recently, and you put up an item on the 2021 Worldwide Threat Assessment by the Director of National Intelligence, and where they've reached this finding that Iran has not conducted key nuclear weapon development activities. And I was wondering whether you might expand on that a little bit. And then a point that others have also made, that 2021 is not 2015 with regard to Iran developing this knowledge and expertise in the new centrifuges. So I was recently speaking on this issue to a senior Iranian, and he really came back at me and said, yes, that is true. But in the 6 years, we've also lost a lot of lives because people were not able to get COVID and other medicines. So yes, 2021 is not 2015. So on the one side, we have this knowledge, but on the other side, we have these acts of sabotage that you mentioned, and also civilians who died because they couldn't get goods and services in the medical area. So I was wondering how the second point might play in the discussions in Washington. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Tarek. Those are some great questions. I would say first, I agree with you on the continuity of knowledge from a technical perspective. But I think one of the challenges we've seen with implementation of the JCPOA is that public trust in verification, can vary significantly. And I think even if the IAEA is able to, rebuild that continuity of knowledge when they review the materials and information provided at the end of the special arrangement, there are still going to be questions, from those who have doubted verification capacity to begin with, about those gaps and what Iran may have done during those gaps. So I see this also from as a sustainability problem in part, because I think it fuels speculation about illicit activities, even if there's no evidence of those illicit activities. But you asked about the worldwide threat assessment, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's a very important conclusion. I hope Ilan will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Worldwide Threat Assessment was not actually released last year. So this is the first one I think that we've seen in in 2 years. And what this essentially demonstrates is that the US intelligence community, through all of their means of intel gathering, has concluded that Iran has not resumed weaponization related work. And I think this is important because it again underscores that the activities that Iran has ongoing, are related to leverage in the talks, that they're not about building a bomb. And I think it also provides some confidence that even though Iran and the IAEA have not, addressed all of the issues and access questions related to Iran's pre-2003 organized nuclear weapons program, that those are about past activities, that there's no indication that those are ongoing activities. So I think the worldwide threat assessment, sort of reinforces that. And again, provides confidence that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon or using this time when there's less monitoring and verification to ratchet up weaponization related activities. And your question about, reversibility on both sides, I think that that's, an important point to keep in mind. When we look at, as you said, the US sanctions violations, you're right. I mean, Iran's economy has been damaged, lives have been lost, despite humanitarian exemptions, it's been difficult, if not impossible, to actually use those channels to provide exempt goods and services, to Iran. So there is a certain amount of irreversibility on both sides. And I think that also, comes back to this question of knowledge on advanced centrifuge development. I mean, unfortunately, there isn't really anything we can do about that knowledge at this point. There isn't really a lot that, we can do in terms of rectifying sort of some of that damage. So I think, the important thing is to focus on, restoring the JCPOA and acknowledging that benefits both sides. And looking at some of these lessons from the first 2 years of implementation to see if it's possible to prevent these mistakes from happening again. So looking at sanctions lifting, from 2016 to 2018, for instance, to see where there were problems, to examine that and look at how we might be able to better spur, investment and economic activity in the future.
Good. Thank you very much, Kelsey. Let me put a couple of questions to Hans Jakob. Hans Jakob, you mentioned the ballistic missile issue and also the way it is phrased in Resolution 2231 about missiles capable of carrying weapons of mass destruction. But the missile issue was not covered in the JCPOA. This was brought in by the US at the very last minute in the blues draft of Resolution 2231. And Iran is not the only country in the region with medium and long range missiles. So I was sort of struck that none of our three speakers brought up this issue of a Middle East zone free of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction and their delivery systems, because that might be one forum in which to engage on these other issues that could be destabilizing with regard to national security perceptions of both regional states and extra-regional states. So I was wondering whether you might have some comments on that. And I also wanted to bring up this issue of INSTEX. I found that you had written an excellent article on the assessment of INSTEX, and you discussed the so-called EU blocking statute and how it was not able to work. And as you mentioned, INSTEX only managed to authorize one transaction. But to outside observers, there's a feeling that the EU really didn't try hard enough. And let me give you an example. In Canada, where I come from, Bombardier had made this new regional jet called the C-300. And Boeing went, and Delta Airlines bought a whole bunch of them, and Boeing then came and got Congress to impose a 300% duty on these jets. And what the Canadian government did was to retaliate. And they found the key areas in the key senators' constituencies that would hurt them and impose $300 million worth of sanctions. Same thing with Airbus. When Boeing targeted subsidies for Airbus, the EU hit back against Boeing for subsidies for the 787 and so on. So my question to you is, did the EU really try hard enough? And were the EU to take a stronger position, perhaps this INSTEX mechanism might have been able to work better than it has. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Interesting question. So let me start with the ballistic missile program. Rightfully so, the US insisted to include this in the resolution because obviously it cannot be included in the JCPOA because the JCPOA only focuses on the nuclear program. But it is not in 2015 that the European side or the US side has voiced strong concerns about this. I understand they're not the only ones. I would question the regional focus of that missile program. Obviously, with the attack on the Saudi oil facilities, they've demonstrated their capabilities regionally, but for many years, and more than 1.5 decades now, they have a peculiar interest in longer range rockets. And why Iran at this point needs a space program is for Iran to explain. But I would just like to say that the technology is not dissimilar from other missiles that need to go long range and have re-entry vehicles. So in a way, there is a great concern on the ballistic missile program. Now, the Middle East free zone is an interesting, of course, avenue to follow if you can find takers. And I'm not sure that Iran would be the only one arguing that this is not the time to discuss this issue. When it comes to a regional free zone. On the INSTEC mechanism, I agree with you that this criticism exists. However, on the legal side, both the blocking statute as well as INSTEX is way beyond what Europeans would go. Let's just be very clear. This or that US administration, there is a clear difference between our relationship to the United States in Europe and our relationship to Iran. Economically, politically, we are under any US administration further aligned with the US. And we are not going to go to economic war to get a project of a couple of million through. When it really hit hard, like automotive industry, you've seen the European reaction. But the reality is, this is not a state-run economy. The legal mechanism was there. There are a couple of pending court cases, which ironically Iranian partners put to European courts under the blocking statute. But with the sanction environment as it was, the blocking statute as it is formulated could have worked, but you could also argue that the sanctions environment as it was at the time made it simply commercially no longer viable to cooperate with Iran for an individual company. And you can't force a company to do economically unviable things. So the EU has done what it could at the situation on the legal front, but of course there would not have been an economic war over this issue with the United States, simply given the economic exchange that the EU has with the United States compared to with Iran. I mean, at least from my perspective, that would have been a very unlikely scenario to develop.
Good, thank you. I thought I would just put it because that comes up. Let me go to Ilan for a minute. Ilan, you and your colleagues put up a report about a year ago called Re-engaging Iran, and where you outlined a number of options, whether for a re-elected Trump administration or for a new administration, and you discussed some of that. And I was wondering whether you could say something more now with regard to the options that you had proposed in that report, and any advice that you would have for the US team. And also, how would you relate your report to the report that Robert Malley did in January for the International Crisis Group? And Robert Malley is the American team leader here in Vienna for the proximity talks, where he very clearly seems to have come out in terms of renewing or restoring the JCPOA as it was, and then discussing remissal and regional issues in a follow-on agreement. And it seems, if we read the media reports, that the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor may be on a different page with regard to this particular issue. So I was wondering what you might wish to say on this. Thank you.
Sure. So let me start with, I mean, I can sort of comparing our report with, the International Crisis Group report. And I actually don't believe at that point that was really a Rob Malley report. I think by that point he was really on his way out. It was much more, as I would probably believe, was this colleague Ali Vaez, who's also a fantastic, analyst of all things Iran. But I wouldn't necessarily attribute everything in there to Rob, especially since ICG doesn't actually put the names of authors on their reports. But frankly, at this point, also just on the point of the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State, are they in different pages? I actually think they're all pretty much on the same page on, step one is compliance for compliance. Step two is expanding on that through a combination of regional issues, and and also nuclear issues. I think that is not nearly as fully baked. I think that there's ideas on the table, and I think that there's going to have to be a lot of more rigorous policy making and discussions internally. But I don't believe there's much disagreement inside the US government there. I think it's just testing a lot of ideas against the reality of what might actually exist. And now how does that compare to where we were in the report we put out last summer? Look, last summer, the report, we made the case for, actually we made the case for a lot of what the US government is doing precisely now. Like step one, try to find a way back into some kind of a nuclear arrangement. At the time, we put up two of the most serious options, where one is a compliance or compliance return. The other was something smaller, like you call it JCPOA minus or a JPOA, just something that kind of stops the program in its tracks for less nuclear rollback for less sanctions relief. And I think that's still a possible option down the line. I will say the one thing that's changed since then is every discussion I've had since then, and everything you've seen from the Iranians publicly, and whether you hear from them in track 2 dialogues, is they're not really interested in that. Right now, they're very much interested in a mutual compliance or compliance return. I think the US would be fine with compliance or compliance, or with one of these other alternatives, as long as it sort of meets the criteria of putting the nuclear program in a box so you can have a longer conversation instead of having this continuing escalatory crisis on the nuclear program. And if we don't get to a deal in the next month or so, and you do have the Rouhani administration leave, and you have negotiations resume in the fall, I think you might find more flexibility on the Iranian side to look at multiple different options as well, because the next team might not be as wedded to the JCPOA. But that's all speculation. Right now, the only game in town, I think realistically, on the nuclear program is compliance or compliance return, and can we get there? And then there's the regional issues, which we also get into in the report, and that also other folks have mentioned here. I very much agree with Kelsey's assessment that the missile issue needs to be done in a regional context. I mean, the biggest issues on missiles, and you hear the Iranians talk about this all the time, that the Gulf states have built up a very significant and capable sort of conventional military capability with arms sales from the United States and Europe, and that the missile program that Iran has built up is a tool, to try to counter that conventionally. I think part of that's fair, part of that's, the Iranians using excuses for building up, their own capabilities. But either way, it's clear that they would be much more open to a negotiation on missile issues inside this regional context than they would be in the context of the JCPOA. So that's like the place to put it. I also very much agree with Kelsey, and we made this point in the report. The idea on nuclear. I think the nuclear weapons free zone is a difficult context within which to work, but for obvious reasons that it's been a challenge for years. But this idea of taking some of the restrictions inside the JCPOA and applying them to other countries, and then coming back and applying them long-term to Iran, and especially on inspections and verification, is, I think, a really good idea, an important one to try to push forward. And then there's a whole bunch of other issues that you can push in the region. Maritime security, looking at some of the regional conflicts and trying to de-escalate them. Yemen probably is the most ripe. All these are really hard, by the way. I should say, this is really easy. We're not going to focus on the nuclear program. And so we're just going to solve like civil wars in Yemen, or, Iraq, instability in Iraq, or challenges in Syria. Like, all these are hard. So you're not going to necessarily solve these things, right? There's no JCPOA for the Middle East. There isn't a piece of paper everybody signs and says we'll take these steps. But can you lower the temperature? Can you make progress in all these different areas? And actually, I will say that, 2021 isn't 2015. One of the positive developments in the last, especially you've seen in the last couple months, has been a lot more regional engagement. The Saudis are talking to the Iranians. The Emiratis are talking to the Iranians. The Saudis are talking to the Turks. Types of, some of the signaling coming out of Riyadh. I mean, peace is not about to break out in the Middle East, but at least signs of practical deal making. Can we do some of that? And I think if you make progress in these different arenas over time, there's no rush. Let's say you get back into the JCPOA. There's no rush to work out the sunset provisions, to deal with things that have a few years before they really become an issue. But if you can make progress on these regional questions, Then over time, you can come back and have a better environment to make more progress on the nuclear issue too, which is really what was the point of one of the big points of our report. And one of the big lessons of, 2015 is if you just do the nuclear and you don't focus on the region, it's going to intrude, it's going to interfere, it's going to make it impossible. But if you make any progress on the nuclear contingent on progress in the region, you might also have big kinds of problems. So you got to separate these, but you got to work on both seriously. And like only such a process can work.
Good, thank you. So we are running out of time, and I thought we will very quickly go through one quick round, and if each of you can keep your comments to a minute or two. So staying with you, Ilan, President Biden is facing more or less the same opposition in Congress to making any deal with Iran, and a number of Republican senators and congressmen have taken to writing letters and I think trying to introduce legislation. And he will face the same problem that if he takes it to Congress, he probably won't be able to win congressional support for it. So how much flexibility does the president have, A, in removing some of the more problematic sanctions, and B, if the US offers any trade benefits or so on, how would he sell it to the domestic opposition in the US?
Sure. Well, this is a challenge. Now, at the end of the day, I think President Biden still has the same flexibility which President Obama had, if not more. I think, if anything, the Democratic Party is more united now than it was in 2015 in supporting a return to the JCPOA. It's not exactly there, but I think he has the flexibility. There is no congressional majority for blocking, a return to the JCPOA. You still need 66 votes for that. You're nowhere near it, right? I mean, so, but there's consistent pressure. And there's also, let's be real, the number 1, 2, and 3 priority for the United States right now, as it is for much of the rest of the world, is COVID, right? And domestic and the economic consequences. So how much political capital he spends on this and foreign policy writ large versus these other challenges, especially early in his administration, like there's a cost there, and that's a challenge for sure. But I think for him to build support, especially at least from some of the more centrist and even like Democrats, folks like the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, and folks like that. I don't think that Menendez is going to stand in the way of a Biden return to the JCPOA. But the more that you can demonstrate, the administration can demonstrate, we have a plan for after the JCPOA to build on it. We're working on that. We're working with the Israelis. We're working with the Gulf states. We're working with the European partners. This isn't just we're going back to the deal and then we're done. And the more credible that plan is and the more action you can see there, I think the more political space you'll have in Washington. And this is actually a place where I think the European states can also work together. The E3 can work together with the US. If you can have common positions between the US and the E3 on some of these other issues and be demonstrating that there is work being done and we're thinking this through and we're going to do this together, that is an important point for the administration to then be able to sell to Congress. I will say, at least right now, I hold out zero hope of being able to make this a bipartisan issue. It just doesn't seem like there's, and if you've seen any of the nomination, the hearings for Biden's nominees, I mean, this has just been an issue. It's been just very politically ugly. So for the moment, I think the administration has to just try to gain support from sort of centrist Dems. And in the long run, maybe if you make progress in the region, you can start to bring on some Republicans.
Okay, good. Thank you. Hans Jakob, a similar question. With the UK having exited the EU, do you think that there is any tension within the E3 with regard to the JCPOA? And also in Germany, there will be a transition in government. Do you think that will affect the German position? And generally of the three, France has had the hardest position against Iran. And I was wondering whether you could also comment on that briefly. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I don't think the Brexit is in any way influencing this particular format. It actually is quite a good format to continue to work with our British friends, although they're no longer having the same color passport than us. So in a way, I don't think that is going to be a hurdle that is to be overcome. The characterization of what the Europeans want to achieve with Iran, how we see Iran's role in all of this, including in the region. I haven't seen too much serious differences between the E3, including, of course, Iran, France being a little bit harder on a variance of the issue, but are not on core issues. Therefore, I also don't think that Brexit in any way will widen the gulf between the British or the Germans on this one. Then the second question was, pardon me, can you repeat?
In Germany, you have a change in government coming, whether that's...
So, generally, Germany elections don't really have any measurable impact, maybe a little bit on tone, on broad strategic issues, but on the issue of Iran and how we go forward, I have not seen a discernible difference between any of the parties that are most likely to form the government this year in September. So that one will have a negligible influence on what's going to happen to the German position on this one. It have, of course, great domestic implications. It's an era ending, as you remember, Angela Merkel is no longer running. But on the foreign policy front, it's going to be fairly unnoticeable, and on Iran, virtually non-existent.
Thank you. And finally, Kelsey, we've all seen that there was this tape leaked of Javad Zarif, where he was criticizing the military and also the late General Soleimani, and then he went and apologized to that family, and the Supreme Leader also criticized and said the Foreign Ministry doesn't make any policy. And so the view is that this was designed to weaken the Iranian negotiating position. And I was wondering whether you think that is a correct interpretation of certain observers, and how would you place this issue with regard to Iran's negotiating position here in Vienna? Thank you.
So, there have been a number of theories as to what, motivated the leak. I mean, in addition to what you said about the leak being used to discredit Zarif, I mean, there's also, analysis that suggests that the leak could have been intentional, to demonstrate how he's been hamstrung by the IRGC to improve his presidential chances or his electoral prospects. I mean, I'm inclined to believe that the former explanation is the more likely, that this was designed to damage him, just because it seems to be part of a pattern of activities that are designed to discredit the Rouhani administration. I think, while this potentially has domestic implications, it doesn't seem to have impacted his credibility in the negotiations in Vienna or stymied progress there. And I've been surprised that a number of these actions, such as the sabotage at Natanz, the decision to go to 60%, that these don't seem to have had a measurable impact on the progress of the talks, which I think is very important, and I think speaks to the dedication and seriousness of the negotiators. So, it could, hamper the political space for Zarif domestically, but I don't see it having an impact on the talks. And I think, ultimately the arbitrator of whether or not Iran accepts an agreement, to restore the JCPOA, that's going to be in the hands of the Supreme Leader. And he seems to have indicated, what he wants out of an agreement. So I think, that will be sort of the final say going forward.
Very good. Thank you very much. A question came in from Robin Collins, I think, about the significance of Iran increasing the enrichment level from 20% to 60%. As Kelsey pointed out, I think this was more to focus the attention of the other parties, and it was also to respond that if you commit these acts of sabotage against us, we will respond by upping our game. You might remember that after the Stuxnet cyber attack, Iran, although it lost centrifuges, it did not lose the monthly production of enriched uranium, which actually went up. So I think this is more symbolic rather than a so-called rush to a nuclear weapon, which requires much more work. And as Kelsey pointed out, the most recent report by the US Director of National Intelligence has its findings that they have not observed any weapons-related work. So with that, may I thank all three of you, Ilan, Hans-Jakob, and Kelsey, for a very interesting discussion. And let me pass the mic back to Claudia from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to thank everyone and to close the proceedings. Thank you again.
I also wish to thank you, all of you, to Elon, thanks to Hank Jacob, to Kelsey and Tariq, for this very interesting insight into the challenging world of negotiations on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. You have provided us a good overview of a complex picture, gave important background information, and a lot of food for thought. I wish to thank our audience from around the world for your stimulating questions. We have learned how important it is to provide a platform for dialogue as this event of today. Allow me to inform you about our next online event, which will take place on Wednesday, 23rd of June, also in cooperation with Atomic Reporters, and will elaborate on the extensions of New START. Thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.